This operation must be a success. There is no other choice. It must succeed one way or another. Those words from Burkina Faso's livestock minister, Ismail Sombier, were not delivered over an abstract economic plan. They came as the country officially received 710 high-performing pregnant cows imported from Brazil. At first glance, this may sound like a simple livestock story, but it is much bigger than that. Burkina Faso has been spending tens of billions of CFA francs every year on imported dairy products. Around the launch of this program, one estimate placed that bill at roughly 22 billion CFA francs a year, or around 39 million United States dollars, depending on the exchange rate. That money helps supply consumers today, but much of the value behind those products is created outside the country. The government is now trying to change that equation. The 710 cows are expected to contribute to a projected 1.2 million liters of milk in 2026. But the real test goes far beyond their first production cycle. These animals are also expected to support genetic improvement and help expand a stronger national dairy herd over time. Behind them is a much wider structure. Burkina Faso is also pushing artificial insemination, livestock feed production, vaccination, veterinary medicines, trained animal health workers, milk collection, and Fasokosam, the state-backed dairy company expected to process and market more locally produced milk. In other words, Burkina Faso is not simply importing cows. It is attempting to build an entire production chain. And that creates a deeper question. Can a country use carefully chosen imports today to reduce long-term dependence tomorrow? Can imported genetics become local milk, local jobs, local processing, stronger farm income, and eventually more money circulating inside Burkina Faso instead of leaving the country through repeated dairy imports? That is why the words "it must succeed" matter. They are not proof that success is guaranteed. They are a standard by which this experiment can eventually be judged. If you are interested in how African countries are trying to keep more of the value from their own resources and production at home, follow this channel. Because the most important part of this story is not what arrived in Lumbila. It is what happens after those cows leave it. To understand why those 710 cows matter, we first have to understand the problem Burkina Faso is trying to solve. The country is not starting from zero. Livestock has long been part of rural life, and cattle can be found across large areas of the country. Yet having cattle is not the same as having a modern dairy industry capable of supplying cities, factories, and consumers every day of the year. For years, local milk production has faced several structural problems. Many herds produce relatively small quantities. Production can change with the seasons, while farmers are often scattered across wide areas. Fresh milk also has to be collected quickly, kept under suitable conditions, transported, tested, and delivered to processors before it spoils. When those connections are weak, milk may exist in the countryside without ever becoming a reliable supply for an urban dairy plant. Imported dairy products fill part of that gap. Milk powder is particularly difficult for local producers to compete against because it can be transported over long distances, stored more easily, and processed when needed. Around the launch of the new cattle program, Burkina Faso officials estimated the country's dairy imports bill at about 22 billion CFA francs annually, roughly 39 million United States dollars depending on the exchange rate. Other public figures have varied, so the safest conclusion is simple. Dairy imports represent a substantial recurring expense. But consider where that money goes. When a finished dairy product is imported, much of the economic activity behind it has already happened somewhere else. The cattle were raised elsewhere. Much of the processing occurred elsewhere. Jobs were created elsewhere. Burkina Faso receives the product while a significant share of the production value remains outside its economy. Now imagine redirecting even part of that demand toward a functioning domestic chain. A farmer earns money for producing milk. Someone supplies feed. Another worker collects the milk. Veterinary services protect the herd. Drivers transport the product. A local plant turns it into pasteurized milk, yogurt, cheese, or butter. Shops sell it, workers earn wages, and part of that income circulates again inside the country. That is the economic promise behind dairy sovereignty. It does not mean Burkina Faso can eliminate imports overnight, and it certainly does not mean imported products are the only reason local production has struggled. The harder challenge is building a domestic system that can compete on quantity, quality, reliability, and price. And this is where the 710 pregnant cows from Brazil enter the story. They are not being presented merely as more cattle. They are being used as the first visible pieces of an attempt to change the productive capacity behind Burkina Faso's milk. On the 11th of March 2026, the strategy became visible at Lumbila. Burkina Faso officially handed 710 high-performing pregnant cows imported from Brazil to selected producers. The herd included 30 Holstein, 430 Girolando, 100 Guzerat, 50 Gyr, and 100 Nelore cattle. They had arrived in the country in late February and completed a quarantine period before being released to the beneficiaries. The largest group is Girolando, a breed developed for dairy production under tropical conditions. Some of the imported breeds have been described by Burkina Faso officials as capable of producing between 15 and 40 liters of milk per day under suitable conditions. But that figure must be treated as potential, not a promise. Feed, water, heat, animal health, and farm management will determine how much of that genetic potential can actually be achieved in Burkina Faso. Government projections nevertheless show the scale of the ambition. The imported animals are expected to contribute to roughly 1.2 million liters of milk during 2026, with officials suggesting that production associated with the program could eventually multiply over the following 5 years. Because these are pregnant animals, their importance also extends beyond the milk they may produce after giving birth. Their offspring can contribute to a longer process of improving the national herd. This creates an interesting economic paradox. Burkina Faso is importing animals in an effort to reduce imports, but importing a productive asset is different from repeatedly importing a finished product. Imported milk is consumed and then must be purchased again. A productive cow can provide milk, reproduce, and potentially pass valuable genetics into future generations. If the program works, part of today's foreign expenditure could therefore help create tomorrow's domestic production capacity. Brazil's role also deserves attention. The initiative followed growing agricultural cooperation between Burkina Faso and Brazil, including Burkina Faso's participation in the second Brazil-Africa Dialogue on Agriculture and Food Security in May 2025. This is often described as South-South cooperation, but it should not be romanticized. Burkina Faso wants genetics, agricultural knowledge, and productive capacity, while Brazil also has economic and diplomatic interests in expanding its relationships across Africa. So, the real measure of this partnership will not be the number of cattle unloaded from transport vehicles. It will be what Burkina Faso learns, reproduces, and eventually controls for itself. If imported genetics can become locally managed herds and steadily expanding domestic production, then buying these cows could become a step toward greater independence. But first, Burkina Faso must keep high-performing animals productive in a demanding Sahel environment, and that may prove much harder than purchasing them. The difficult part begins after the cattle leave Lumbila. High-performing genetics can create opportunity, but genetics alone cannot fill a milk tank. These animals need the conditions that allow their potential to become real production. That means reliable feed, sufficient water, protection from excessive heat, veterinary care, and disciplined farm management. In Burkina Faso, where long dry periods can put pressure on both water and pasture, every one of those conditions matters. Feed may be the first major test. A cow expected to produce large quantities of milk cannot be managed exactly like an animal kept under a traditional low-input system. Higher production requires better and more consistent nutrition. This helps explain why the government has been developing livestock feed capacity alongside the dairy program. The logic is straightforward. Better genetics without better nutrition could leave farmers owning expensive animals that never reach their productive potential. Heat and water create another challenge. Girolando cattle have advantages in tropical environments, but tropical adaptation does not mean immunity to heat stress. When temperatures become severe, milk production, reproduction, and animal health can suffer. Farmers therefore need adequate water, suitable housing, shade, and careful observation. The true test will not be how these animals perform during a ceremonial presentation, but how they perform through Burkina Faso's changing seasons. Animal health is equally important. The government has been strengthening vaccination, veterinary diagnostics, access to medicines, and specialized animal health support. It has also promoted artificial insemination as part of the broader effort to improve cattle genetics. This matters because losing a high-value pregnant cow means losing more than today's milk. It can also mean losing a calf, future breeding potential, and part of the public investment made in building a stronger national herd. Ismail Sombie offered farmers a simple comparison. A vehicle worth 1 million CFA francs is not maintained in the same way as a vehicle worth 20 million. His message was that these imported cattle should be treated like valuable productive assets. Receiving them at a subsidized price brings an opportunity but also a responsibility to provide the feeding, housing, medical care, and monitoring they require. And even if Burkina Faso succeeds in keeping the cows healthy and producing more milk, another problem immediately appears. Fresh milk cannot simply remain on the farm. It must find a buyer, be collected quickly, processed safely, and reach consumers at a competitive price. That is why the next part of this strategy may ultimately matter as much as the cows themselves. Its name is Fasokosam. Fasokosam is where Burkina Faso's dairy experiment moves from the farm into the wider economy. The state-owned company was created after the government took control of an existing dairy enterprise that had not developed the processing capacity authorities wanted. Fasokosam was then given a broader mission: secure local milk, process it, preserve it, and sell dairy products made inside Burkina Faso. This matters because producing milk is only half the battle. Fresh milk is highly perishable. A farmer may successfully increase production, but without a reliable buyer nearby, those additional liters can quickly become a problem instead of an opportunity. Fasokosam is intended to create that missing market. Its facilities can transform raw milk into products such as pasteurized milk, yogurt, cheese, and butter, allowing more value to be created after the milk leaves the farm. The network has gradually expanded beyond Ouagadougou. Facilities have been established in places including Fada, Nguma, and Leo, while additional expansion has been discussed for other production areas. Some facilities remain modest in size. The Leo operation, for example, began with a nominal capacity of around 300 liters per day. That is nowhere near enough to transform Burkina Faso's entire dairy market, but the strategy appears to be building multiple links rather than relying on one enormous factory. Milk collection is another crucial part of that system. Burkina Faso has explored collection centers capable of handling roughly 300 to 1,000 liters per day. These centers can provide a place where milk from surrounding producers is gathered, checked, temporarily stored, and prepared for transportation. For farmers scattered across rural areas, that bridge between the farm and the processor may determine whether producing additional milk is economically worthwhile. If the system works, 1 liter of local milk can support far more activity than the farmer who produced it. It can create demand for feed, veterinary care, transportation, refrigeration, packaging, processing, retail, and labor. Instead of importing a finished dairy product whose earlier stages of value creation occurred abroad, Burkina Faso can attempt to capture more of those stages inside its own economy. But Fasokosam also creates a new test. A state-owned dairy company must still collect enough milk, control quality, operate efficiently, pay producers on workable terms, and sell products that consumers actually want. A factory does not create sovereignty simply because it carries the national flag. Its value depends on whether the entire chain can function. And this emphasis on keeping production and processing at home leads directly to the broader economic vision associated with Ibrahim Traore. This brings us to Ibrahim Traore. He did not personally manage the 710 cows, and he does not run Fasokosam from day to day. Those responsibilities belong to ministries, veterinary services, state enterprises, and producers. His influence is broader. Under his leadership, food sovereignty, domestic production, and local processing have been placed near the center of Burkina Faso's economic strategy. Traore has repeatedly argued that Burkina Faso should produce more of what its people consume and process more of its own raw materials at home. The principle is simple. When a country produces an agricultural commodity but sends the most valuable stages of processing elsewhere, much of the employment, industrial knowledge, and profit can also live with it. The dairy strategy follows the opposite direction. Produce the milk locally, process it locally, and try to keep more of the resulting economic activity inside Burkina Faso. The government has backed this approach with direct intervention. In 2024, it nationalized enterprises involved in livestock feed and dairy production as part of its food sovereignty agenda. Fasokosam emerged from that restructuring. The government has also invested heavily in agricultural equipment and inputs, while livestock policy has expanded into feed production, animal health, genetic improvement, and processing. The 710 Brazilian cows therefore fit into a much larger pattern rather than standing as an isolated purchase. This is also where Traore's concept of self-reliance becomes more interesting. Self-reliance does not necessarily mean refusing foreign cooperation. Burkina Faso is working with Brazil precisely because it does not yet possess every resource it wants. The deeper objective is to use outside genetics, technology, knowledge, and partnerships to increase what Burkina Faso can eventually produce and manage for itself. The real question is whether dependence decreases as domestic capability grows. That makes the dairy program a useful test of Traore's broader economic vision. If better cattle lead to more local milk, if Fasokosam turns that milk into competitive products, if farmers earn sustainable incomes, and if imports gradually decline, then the government will have evidence that its approach can produce measurable economic results. If those links fail, political determination alone will not rescue the system. That distinction matters. A president can establish priorities, mobilize public resources, and demand results. But no political order can command a cow to produce more milk, make feed inexpensive, or force consumers to buy an uncompetitive product. In the end, Traore's vision will be judged not by the strength of its language, but by what happens in farms, factories, markets, and household incomes. And that brings us to the people whose success matters most, Burkina Faso's livestock producers. For Burkina Faso's livestock producers, the promise of dairy sovereignty becomes personal. National strategies may be announced in government offices, but the final result depends on what happens inside individual farms. The producers receiving these high-performing cattle now have access to animals with greater productive potential, veterinary support, genetic improvement programs, and a growing processing network that needs more local milk. For farmers who have struggled for years to expand production, that combination could create a very different future. One beneficiary, already producing around 100 liters of milk per day, said she hoped the new cattle could help double or even triple her farm's output. That illustrates the opportunity. If a producer can move from 100 liters to 200 or 300 liters per day and has a dependable buyer, the farm can generate more economic activity. More production can mean additional workers, greater demand for feed, more transportation, and more business for veterinary services. But there is an important difference between producing more milk and earning more money. High-performing cattle can also be more expensive to maintain. Better feed costs money. Veterinary treatment costs money. Water, housing, labor, transportation, and cooling all add to the final cost of every liter. A farmer who doubles production but sees expenses rise even faster has not achieved economic sovereignty. That farmer has simply acquired a larger and more complicated operation. This is where Fasokosam becomes critical. A farmer needs more than cows. The farmer needs a reliable customer willing to purchase milk regularly under conditions that make production worthwhile. Yet there is still limited public information about the exact prices Fasokosam pays producers, the full cost of maintaining these imported cattle, or the profit farmers can expect from each additional liter. Those numbers will eventually tell us more than speeches or ceremonies. If the chain works, however, the effects can spread far beyond the farm. Money paid for local milk can move through feed suppliers, workers, veterinarians, drivers, collection centers, processors, packaging businesses, retailers, and families. The same consumer spending that once supported a largely foreign production chain can support more economic activity inside Burkina Faso. That is why farmers are the real center of this experiment. Fasokosam can build processing facilities and the government can import better genetics, but neither can create a sustainable dairy industry if producers cannot make a reasonable living. And even profitable farmers still face one final competitor. It sits quietly on store shelves, travels easily across borders, and can often be stored far longer than fresh milk. The next battle is against imported dairy products. The next battle is fought on the store shelf. Burkina Faso can improve cattle genetics, expand milk collection, and build processing facilities. But local dairy products still have to compete with imports that already have established supply chains. Milk powder has an obvious advantage. It can travel long distances, remain usable much longer than fresh milk, and be reconstituted or processed when manufacturers need it. Those advantages can make imported products difficult for local farmers to challenge on price. The issue is even more complicated in West Africa because some imported products use milk powder, in which part of the dairy fat has been replaced with vegetable fat. Research from the French Agricultural Research Organization CIRAD has examined how these lower-cost products have expanded in West African markets. They can help provide affordable food to consumers, but researchers have also raised concerns about their economic impact on local dairy chains and about whether consumers always understand exactly what they are buying. This is where the debate involving Europe becomes more nuanced than the simple claim that the West opposes Burkina Faso's dairy sovereignty. There is no solid evidence that Western governments have organized opposition specifically against the 710 Brazilian cows or Fasokosam. In fact, European institutions, researchers, journalists, and development organizations have expressed different views about dairy trade with West Africa. One argument is that imported dairy products serve a genuine need. Local production in many West African countries does not yet provide enough reliable supply to satisfy total demand. From this perspective, imports help keep products available to consumers. Another argument is that cheap imported products can make it harder for local farmers to develop the scale necessary to compete. Both arguments can be true at the same time. That means Burkina Faso faces a difficult balance. Restrict imports too quickly before domestic production is ready and consumers could face shortages or higher prices. Leave local producers permanently exposed without improving their competitiveness, and the country may struggle to build the dairy industry it wants. The stronger strategy is therefore not simply to attack imports. It is to make local production progressively more competitive in quality, availability, and price. Ultimately, consumers will help decide whether this strategy succeeds. Fasokosam can carry a national identity, but patriotism alone cannot guarantee repeat purchases. Families need products that are safe, affordable, available, and worth buying. The real contest will not be won through political slogans or arguments about the West. It will be won when local milk can compete in ordinary markets. And that brings us back to the government's uncompromising declaration. This operation must succeed. Now we return to the words that open this story. The operation must succeed. But what would success actually look like? Not a ceremony, not photographs of 710 cattle, and not another government announcement. Burkina Faso's dairy strategy will ultimately face 7 practical tests, and each one can determine whether this investment becomes a productive system or an expensive experiment. The first test is genetics. These cattle must remain productive, reproduce successfully, and help improve future generations. The second is feed and water. High-performing animals need dependable nutrition and adequate water throughout the year. If feeding costs become too high, impressive milk yields may still produce weak profits. The third test is animal health. Vaccination, veterinary monitoring, medicines, and disease control must protect animals whose value extends far beyond a single season of milk. The fourth test is collection. Fresh milk has little economic value if it spoils before reaching a processor. Farmers need collection points, refrigeration, transportation, and predictable schedules. The fifth test is processing. Fasokosam must turn growing volumes of raw milk into products consumers can actually use, while operating its facilities efficiently enough to control costs. A processing plant that regularly operates far below capacity cannot become the foundation of national dairy sovereignty. The sixth test is the market. Burkina Faso families must be willing and able to buy locally processed milk, yogurt, cheese, and butter. These products will compete not only through national pride but through price, quality, safety, convenience, and availability. The seventh test may be the most important of all. Economic results. Are livestock producers making sustainable profits? Are new jobs being created? Is more value staying inside Burkina Faso? And over time, is the country's dairy import bill actually declining? This is also where political determination meets economic reality. Ibrahim Traore can make food sovereignty a national priority. Ismail Sombier can tell every institution involved that failure is not an option. The government can mobilize resources and demand discipline. But political authority cannot order cattle to remain productive, make feed cheap, keep every animal healthy, or force families to purchase products they cannot afford. So the phrase "it must succeed" should not end the debate. it should begin the accounting. 5 years from now, the question should not be whether Burkina Faso successfully imported 710 cows. The question should be whether those cows helped create a dairy system capable of reproducing, expanding, processing, competing, and eventually standing on its own. If that happens, the lesson could reach far beyond Burkina Faso. If Burkina Faso succeeds, the lesson for Africa will not be that every country should import hundreds of Brazilian cattle. The deeper lesson is about building an entire chain. Producing more raw material is not enough. A country needs farmers who can earn a living, reliable transport, storage, processing, distribution, and consumers willing to buy the final product. Miss one important link, and the value can still escape somewhere along the way. There is another lesson that deserves attention. Self-reliance does not require isolation. Burkina Faso imported these cattle from Brazil because foreign genetics can help strengthen domestic productive capacity. African countries can import machinery, technology, breeding stock, and technical knowledge while still pursuing economic sovereignty. The important question is what remains after the foreign partner leaves. Has the country gained skills, productive assets, and the ability to reproduce that capacity for itself? Or has it simply created a new dependency? That principle matters across the continent. Mali under Assimi Goïta, Niger under Abdourahmane Tchiani, and other countries across West Africa and the Sahel are confronting their own questions about sovereignty and economic dependence. Their answers do not have to be identical, nor should replacing France or another Western partner with Brazil, Russia, China, or anyone else automatically be called independence. Real diversification should increase national choices, not merely change the name of the outside power on which a country depends. This is also a wider question for the African Union. Africa produces enormous quantities of agricultural commodities and natural resources, yet too often the higher value stages of processing take place elsewhere. The lesson from Burkina Faso is still unproven, but the ambition is clear: capture more stages of the value chain at home. For Africa News, that may become one of the most important economic stories of the coming years, especially as governments search for practical meaning behind the language of sovereignty. And this brings us back to Ibrahim Traore. His political message can encourage people to believe that Burkina Faso can depend more heavily on its own productive strength, but the durability of that message will depend on results. 5 years from now, success should be visible in healthier herds, profitable farmers, functioning processing plants, competitive products, new jobs, and a smaller need to send money abroad for dairy imports. So when officials say this operation must succeed, the most important response may be a question: where will that success appear? In the number of cattle, in the amount of milk, or in the amount of economic value that remains in Burkina Faso? If this experiment works, its greatest achievement will not be 710 imported cows. It will be the domestic system that grows around them. Tell us which African country and which industry should attempt something similar, and follow the channel as we continue examining the changing economic future of Africa. We sincerely appreciate your time and support. Every video on this channel is carefully researched, thoughtfully written, and meticulously edited by our dedicated team. We don't rely on automated production or shortcuts to create our content. Every story, every visual, and every detail is crafted with genuine care, passion, and a commitment to bringing you meaningful, high-quality videos.